From time to time, the ubiquitous internet gives us an opportunity and gives these members of the ever-enlarging Guyanese diaspora an opportunity to share their views with us in Guyana. For me, it is especially a pleasure when I have the opportunity to talk with one of these members of the Guyana diaspora on Plain Talk, and today that will be our opportunity. Welcome back to Plain Talk today as I talk with Dr. David Hinds, member of the Guyana diaspora. David, welcome back to Guyana.
Thank you very much, Chris.
I say welcome back to Guyana, although I know that you left here, I think, 1987.
Right, yeah.
You've been a regular visitor to these shores. You're a regular contributor to the letter columns of Stabroek News. You're still keenly interested in the social and political developments of Guyana. What brings you back to Guyana so regularly?
There's only one place called home, and I've always been committed to my country, Guyana. Sometimes I'm a little bit disappointed about what's happening here in the country, but I come back because I still have some hope for this country, and I still think that my generation can play some kind of meaningful role in trying to put Guyana on the kind of road that we all know that it needs to be on. So I think by coming back and inserting myself, if only for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month each year, it gives me that kind of vigor that I need to keep my sanity as regards things that happening here in Guyana. And to be frank with you, at some point in the very near future, I think I want to come back and live here and to make some kind of contribution towards the forward movement of this country.
How representative, David, is that of the Guyanese living abroad, the Guyanese of your generation, as you say?
I think there is an ambivalence. Eh? On the one hand, there are a lot of people who are keen on contributing, even if they don't feel that they can live here 12 months per year. More and more people of my generation and younger people are saying that, look, you know, I want to come back to Guyana to do business. I want to come back to Guyana to teach, if only just for half of the year, and take it easy like that. And then there's the other response, which is that I can't deal with Guyana. I can't deal with the kind of political problems that are occurring in Guyana. And the response is a response to the kind of dog fight, dog eat dog politics in the country. But I think above and beyond all of that, I still detect a love for Guyana, a feeling among the diaspora at large that they want to contribute to this country one way or the other.
You live in California?
I live in California at the moment, yeah.
How significant is the Guyanese population?
Not very significant. California is a pretty large place, and I live in the LA area.
Which is famous for its police force.
Among other things. There is a Guyanese association there, and they do some things once or twice per year. At Easter time, there is a big kite flying thing, and all the Guyanese come out and so on. They do something around the Guyanese independence. There's a very vigorous and very lively Linden association, Linden as in Mackenzie association. But it's very difficult to organize in the LA area because it's so large and people are scattered all over the place. I really am based in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area, and I've just been in the LA area for the last year and a half. And in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and in the New York area, people are much more organized there. And we always say that there are so many Guyanese organizations. In Washington, D.C. metropolitan area alone, there are, 26 or 27 Guyanese organizations. So that tells the story about what people think about their own country.
You mentioned your generation. First generation migrants to the United States.
Right.
What about the kids of these first generation, the second generation Guyanese? How do they think about Guyana?
Very curious about Guyana. Very curious about Guyana. You see, as you know, North America could be a very rough place. And you're reminded every day that you don't belong there, you belong somewhere else, even when you're born there to immigrant parents. And I have found a lot of curiosity among the kids, especially those who are just about senior in high school or going on to college and so forth. I get dozens of calls per week from young people who want to know about Guyana. They want to find books on Guyana. They want to know where they can go to get information on Guyana. Young people call me and comment on things that I write in the Stabrook News, or sometimes I do an online column. And when I ask them where they're from, they say they're born in the United States of Guyanese parents. So there is a curiosity among the young people.
On Saturday night, I think Sunday night, we both met at the Hotel Tower.
Right.
We had a wonderful night.
Yeah.
I met a young man who introduced himself as the son of a P.D. Sharma, who was a contemporary of mine in Ministry of Health. And this guy has been living out in the States even longer.
Mm-hmm.
He's about 20-something. He said to me, you know, I don't understand why Guyanese in the United States bad talk and bad mouth their country as much as they do. Mm-hmm. He absolutely enjoyed it. Now, of course, he's on holiday, which is very different from living here and joining the queue and getting involved in the political and racial milieu.
Mm-hmm.
Why this ambivalence, to use your word, about Guyana among the very Guyanese who you say so love this place?
Yeah, it has to do with the politics. I think Guyanese overseas are embarrassed at the kind of political situation in the country. Having gone to live in the United States, and the horizons have opened up, and they come into contact with different cultures, people from different places and so on. They get a better understanding, I think, of politics on a larger scale. And so when they look at the kind of politics that we have here, the kind of racial situation, racial politics that we have here, the lack of forward thinking and vision on the part of the politicians, I think they're kind of embarrassed about that, and they resent it, and they express it. And sometimes if you don't listen keenly, you get the sense that they're bad talking Guyana. But let me tell you something, Chris. I mean, there is no other people who defend their country against other people, when other people bad talk their country, than Guyanese. No, they bad talk.
That's our right.
Yeah, that's their right. But anybody who attempts to bad talk Guyana, they get on the case. Curious, I mean, I do a radio program in the Washington metropolitan area. I also do a television program. And sometimes I'm extremely critical of Guyana. And I get calls from people who kind of support the work that I do. And they say, well, you know, please tone down a little. Don't go so hard. Remember, that's your country. And then they will continue. But man, I don't know what's going on in that place. You know, so it's that ambivalence, and I think it has to do, like I say, with the kind of signals that they get on the political situation.
Many Guyanese who left Guyana in the Burnham and the 50s and 60s and 70s and even 80s left with a certain view of Guyana where the races were in fact at open war against each other. They carry a tremendous amount of baggage. How do they deal with that when they get there? You talk about the openness, but you also talk about 26 organizations and so on. Isn't that the same problem that we have in Guyana here?
Yes. And you're quite right about that. Yeah? In instances as in Maryland, for example, they come together and they work together. There are Hindu organizations, Muslim organizations, there are village organizations, high school organizations. And they come together once or twice per year, and they work well together. But everybody works in their little pocket and so on. And there have been a few of us who have tried very, very hard to bring them together, and they respond. But you know, you're quite right. There's an element in the Guyanese community outside that still carries that racial baggage. And I think that has been the biggest problem. So that there are Indian communities that are very hostile to Africans and African communities, and African communities that are hostile. So you have that. And so it's not a clear-cut situation. One has to search and one has to understand the people that you're dealing with to get a real, true picture of the Guyanese community out there.
From time to time, and especially as we seek to mobilize funds for general elections, our leaders go out there, the PPP and its leaders, PNC and its leaders, Ravidev.
Yes.
To what extent that helps the Guyanese community abroad, or it helps to re-emphasize that division and baggage?
It helps to re-emphasize the division. Because if you're going to beg for money, then you've got to talk a certain kind of language. If you're going to the Indian business community, you've got to make certain, you've got to give them certain assurances. And we know when in Guyana we talk about giving assurances, we use these code words and so on. And so that activity on the part of the Guyanese political leadership outside re-emphasizes that thing. And you know, I follow what the leaders say here in Guyana, and I try to follow what they say overseas. And they have two different messages. So that tells you a story. You know, some of the political leaders go overseas and they talk straight race because they play into the gallery. In New York, for example, no leader will have a meeting where Brooklyn and Queens will come together. They'll have a separate meeting in Brooklyn, depending on which race the leader belongs to. And then, if you belong to another race or so, you will have a separate meeting in Queens. So that is how things are dealt with. You know, PPP leaders don't go to Brooklyn when they go overseas to hold meetings. I think President Jack Dio went to a college there, and Mrs. Jagan, when she was president, went to college. But when PPP leaders go through, they concentrate a lot in the Queens area. And similarly, when the PNC leaders go through there, they concentrate a lot in the Brooklyn area and don't go into Queens. And that's the reality of the situation there. So in a sense, the racial situation is much more acute, if you will, in the United States in some respects than here in Guyana.
It must be an awful responsibility on people like you who are following this different kind of language depending on the audience. What responsibility do you have to point that out, not only in your radio and television program abroad, but also in your newspapers at home, to expose this kind of hypocrisy and doublespeak?
You're quite right. I think, you know, some of us have a responsibility, and that is why I contribute, if you will, to the local newspapers and so forth. But you come up against not censorship, but, well, yes, censorship, because newspapers have to censor themselves for libel and all kinds of other things. There is an unwillingness, I find, in sections of the media in Guyana to talk very frankly about certain things. And I think an issue like that, in terms of double speak, like I call it, is not something that that will be discussed in a very frank manner. But yet I think it has to be pursued. People have to know that there's this kind of double speak. There's double speak going on right here in Guyana. Some people say one thing in Georgetown and then they go to somewhere on the East Coast or somewhere in West Bobis or somewhere on the West Coast and they say something else.
Or they send one leader in one district and say something and another leader in another.
Yeah, it's part of the Guyanese political culture, at least the elite political culture, where this double speak, you say one thing for one audience and you say something for another audience. You say one thing at the street corner in Georgetown, you say another thing at the bottom houses in the country area. And it's the same thing that you do in the United States. And I think there's a responsibility on the part of some of us to hammer away and point this kind of thing out and try to have these leaders recognize that in terms of moving this country forward, we've got to begin to be very honest and open in terms of the messages we send.
You mentioned it is about his great love, hope, disappointment, which also is an expression of affection. You're only disappointed in someone or something if you care for that something. Why is it more people do not express an opinion? And one can think of Clarence Ellis, Ramesh Kampat, who I haven't seen in the press recently, and yourself. You stand out. Why are more people not taking this kind of interest?
You know,
given the internet and the ease to which you can just get a letter off to the Stabroek News or to the Chronicle.
You know, Chris, sadly, the experience that we had in the 1970s and the 1980s where people were Muslim, after a time, you know what happened? People began Muslim themselves. A lot of people who migrated during that period are still Muslim. They Muslim themselves. They will call me, they will call Mr. Ellis, and they will eloquently express opinions, but they would not write to the Stabroek News. They would say, boy, I'm not touching that, you know. And there is no reason for them to be fearful, I mean, whatever one can say about what has happened in this country over the last 8 years or so, and if we can even go back to the Hoyt era of 1985, that there has been a kind of slackening, if you will, of the kind of authoritarianism that we had. So free speech, I think, is something we have to some extent in the United States. But yet people...
In the United States?
Well, I mean, here in Guyana. But yet people who live in the United States, away from the theater, are still afraid, I mean, to express their opinions openly.
Your letters, invariably, to the extent that letters appear under your name, are in the Stabroek News. Why don't you address your letters to the Chronicle?
In the beginning, I addressed my letters, and I still do sometimes, to both the Stabroek News and the Chronicle. For some reason, people does not carry my letters. I wrote a note some time ago, early this year, to the editor asking why some of my letters are not being carried. And, you know, he expressed that sometimes there is space, sometimes it's repetition, and so on. And he carried a few letters after then, but for the last 7 or 8 months, I've been cut out entirely from the Chronicle. Even when people criticize me in the Chronicle and I send responses, they're not published, and I really don't know. I guess I express anti-government sentiments, and frankly speaking, I think I'm surprised at the role that the Chronicle plays in the society. Now, after what we experienced during the Burnham era, the PNC era, and what they did with the state media and so on.
And even the private media like the Catholic
Standard. And the private media like Catholic Standard, one would expect that there would be some kind of balance on the part of the Chronicle in this new era. And I'm totally surprised at how the Chronicle has behaved. Really, I mean, in my estimation, the Chronicle carries a stronger PPP position than even the Mirror, you see. So I suppose because I'm critical of the PPP, so my letters are not carried in the Chronicle, and I'm disappointed about that.
You're disappointed, but you're familiar with politics.
Yeah.
Isn't payback part of the political culture of third world countries?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And when you have ethnically divided countries like Guyana, it's worse. There is this thing about payback. One side tries to keep the other side out. When the other side gets in, it decides that it's going to pay back. Now, that is a fact of life in third world countries, and I don't expect it to go away automatically. But I think when you look at the situation, and when you look at the dire situation that Guyana is in, it must push you to make some kind of compromises. So I expect that, yes, there would have been payback here in Guyana, but I expect that after 8 years, that there will be some leveling off of that. I could stomach it in the first 4 years or so. It's human element, it's a political element, but after 8 years, I can't stomach it.
You said there is both hope and disappointment among the Guyanese abroad. What gives rise to this hope? Is it just faith?
Faith. That's it. It's fate. It is, Guyanese, like most people in third world, poor people, poor countries, are God-fearing. Hmm? And there is this optimism that one day Guyana will rise. People still talk about this great wealth that Guyana is. Guyana has this, what a rich country we are, and so on. There is still that burning hope that one day Guyana will just get over this thing. When you begin to ask people, how are we going to do it? Then that's where the problem comes in. But that hope is based on faith. Yeah.
And the disappointment.
Disappointment, as I hinted before, has to do with the politics. I think Guyanese overseas, and I dare say from talking to Guyanese here, supporters of the two major parties, there's a disappointment that our leaders have not been able to move beyond mere partisanship. I think there is a level at which people expect that partisanship must play a role in politics. After all, that's what political parties are for. But I think there's a disappointment that we've not been able to at least contain the racial problem. I don't think any Guyanese, in their right senses, would expect that the racial problems that we have and that manifest themselves at the level of our politics will go away, in the next 10, 15 years. But I think they expect better. They expect better from our politicians. When I left the United States, and I talked to, Guyanese all the time, and they express a lot of disappointment why there is a problem about what happens after January 17th. They're appalled. They feel that at least we can get that right, even though we don't get the other things right. So the disappointment is the behavior of our political leaders. They're not doing sufficient to put country before party.
Given that hope is born only of faith and the disappointment is rooted in reality, what's the likelihood of these Guyanese who possess the intellectual, financial, and perhaps moral capital ever returning to help build this country or rebuild the country?
Well, there's some practical issues that one has to deal with when you talk about that. The issue of economics. Yeah? A lot of people that you're talking about, they're professionals, and they would expect a kind of standard of living that they're accustomed to, or somewhere near to that. And so there is that practical problem. Guyana is a small country, and the truth of the matter is, let's say you're a historian. I mean, there's so many historians that Guyana can accommodate. There's only one university and so forth. So there's the practical reality of the economics. But I think there's also the frustration that Guyana is a place that you can come to visit, that you can hope that you will go back to. But the reality of the situation, as it stands now, is that you have to wait and see. So you're enthusiastic. You want to come back. You probably pack your bag and ready, and then you unpack. Because, the reality is that the country is not ready for that influx of people from the diaspora. I've heard that a lot of people came back when the PPP got into power in 1992, and a lot of them have left for a number of reasons. The role that politics plays in terms of normal developmental issues, interference in the work that people do, and so on. These kinds of things frustrate people who live in the United States and Canada and other parts of the developed world, and are accustomed to a kind of separation of politics and the running of the country.
You spent 2 weeks in Guyana during this visit, much of it, of course, over the long holiday period. What are your impressions, to the extent that you've been able to get to look seriously at what's happening? What are your impressions on the state of Guyana now?
I am disappointed. I'm disappointed in the psychological state of Guyana. Yes, there are lots of big houses around, and people are still vigorous. Guyanese have a lot of energy in spite of
enterprise. Yes,
and enterprise. I mean, I'm really impressed with that. But beyond that, I am somewhat depressed, Chris. The level of illiteracy that jumps out at you wherever you go in this country, the kind of lack of discipline in everything that people do in this country, whether we drive in, whether when we go out to party, the way we speak to each other, there is sadly something lacking there. And I also detect a tiredness with politics. A tiredness with politics. Yet, when you introduce the question of election, people light up. But the response is a racial response. Huh? It's not a national response. It's a racial response, and people believe that what they're expressing is a national response. But in effect, it's a racial response. So I detect a certain kind of tiredness, a certain kind of cynicism among Guyanese that doesn't bode well for the future. And the fact that our civil society here in Guyana is not strong. In fact, I don't feel that we have a civil society here in Guyana, because all sections of what is supposed to be civil society are in some way tied up with the political parties and so forth. And that kind of blunts the way in which they can function. And civil society is not able to contribute to that process of that regeneration, that spiritual regeneration of the country, which I think has to come about.
I'm speaking in plain talk today with Dr. David Hinds, Guyanese, who resides in California, USA, and who is on visit to Guyana. We'll take an ad break now. Welcome back to Plain Talk. As I discuss with Dr. David Hinds his views on the state of Guyana, both from the perspective of someone living in North America and taking a continuing and caring interest on what happens here. I was going to ask you about civil society, but I think you've dealt with it. It's tainted, it's afraid, it's unwilling to challenge for the space that it really owns.
Doesn't live up to its responsibility. There are issues that I see every day here in Guyana, that in Barbados, I'm not even going to the United States and those big countries, in the rest of the Caribbean, that academics and the media would be eating it up, would be going vigorously and ventilating and bringing it to the fore to be discussed, and you don't have that in Guyana. There's not a conversation, Chris, going on here in Guyana. That's one of my observations. Huh? We talk. There's a lot of talk in Guyana. But there's very little conversation on what needs to be done to move Guyana forward. There's very little conversation on the problems that we face. We talk about the problems, but we don't have a conversation as to how we can deal with these problems. No civil society, because there's no civility at the level of those opinion makers and opinion shapers here in Guyana.
You've been a member of the Working People's Alliance, the party of Dr. Walter Rodney.
Yeah.
What's your view on Guyana's and Guyanese view and treatment of Dr. Walter Rodney, the legacy of Dr. Walter Rodney?
I think it's one of the areas that I am angry about. To say disappointed would be an understatement. I'm angry about it. Because Walter Rodney, easily in our post-independence era, is the most important public figure that this country has produced. Don't take my word for it. Go to Jamaica. Go to St. Lucia. Go to Barbados.
Tanzania.
Go to Tanzania. I've had students, when they hear my accent, ask me, have you read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa? Do you know Walter Rodney? Tremendous esteem, tremendous knowledge. Someone that Guyana can use to make itself important to the rest of the world, and also use to lift this country. Because Rodney is not just a politician, and I'm saying is deliberately. He's not just a politician. He's not just a scholar. It's an institution that other countries and other institutions are using to move themselves forward. And here in Guyana, we're not using it. Guyanese people, because of the political divide, and because what happened and what was happening during the time that Rodney was here, can be excused for not being intimately knowledgeable about Rodney and what he represents. But those in authority, and not just the government, but I'm talking here now about civil society, I'm talking here about opposition parties, they have a role to advance Rodney and the Rodneyite principles to a central place in the scheme of things in Guyana. And they've not done so. I don't think, even for those who Rodney was a threat to 20 years ago, I don't think he's so much a threat, he ought to be so much a threat to them today. And so I'm disappointed about that. Why are Rodney's books not being used in our schools? Lakshmi out of India, Kofi Badu out of Africa, why are they not standard texts in the schools? Why is all Europe underdeveloped Africa not a standard text for upper level students in high schools? It's an indictment of the kind of simpleness that we deal with here in Guyana. And so therefore I'm extremely disappointed. And I want to...
Angry.
Yeah, angry. I want to use this forum to call on the powers that be to please use Rodney, and by extension use our other institutions here in Guyana, so that we can lift ourselves.
Martin Carter.
Martin Carter, for example. You know, use these people. Use them. Let's move beyond politics, and let's have a kind of national vision.
We still have people like Rupert Roopnarine and the ideals he embraces.
Exactly. I mean, there's no reason why Ian MacDonald, who's a beautiful writer, ought not to be taught to children in school. Just for the sheer art of writing, which I understand is something that is a thing of the past in this country. You know, we have them here. We have institutions here. We have people who are being used in other parts of the world. Why don't we use them? I think, and since we're on the issue of education, I really do think that we ought to really go back to the drawing board. The WPA once said that we need to declare a state of emergency in education. That is more urgent now.
That was the 1992 manifesto.
1992 manifesto, and repeated in 1997. We need to declare a state of emergency in education. This is a knowledge-based world that we're living in. You know that. Most of us are aware of that. And we are so far behind. Investment. We're asking people to come and invest in Guyana. People are only going to invest where there are skills. If you don't have skills, then people are not going to invest. And these days, skills mean that you have to have the basic. And so we've got to go back to the drawing board. You know, Ian MacDonald was making the case in his article a few weeks ago and pointing out the stark reality of the situation. Is anybody listening?
Sadly for you, one has to talk about the state of the WPA,
Yeah.
its lack of appeal to the Guyanese public.
Mm-hmm.
What's your own view?
My own view is that the WPA has become a victim of circumstances. And I'm not saying this because I think the WPA, like all other political parties, made tactical mistakes in the past, tactical mistakes over the last 8 years or so, in terms of how it went about dealing with Guyanese. But having said that, I think it has become a victim of circumstances. One, it came out of that radical tradition, yeah? And it put itself forward as a kind of multiracial party, hoping to heal the racial divide in the country. Succeeded to some extent in the anti-dictatorial era, where because the country was faced with this hostile government, this hostile regime, that they answered the call and responded to the Rodney and WPA call for a kind of multiracial front. But the experience has shown that in ethnically divided countries or other segmented countries, that once that democratic opening comes, then people are resistant to that kind of multiracial appeal. And my own personal view is that the WPA then has to not abandon its multiracial message, but I think it has to look at the situation and recognize that this is a new era and it calls for a new kind of message. Now, there's not very much space out there for third parties whether it be the WPA or any other party, because I think the country is much more polarized now than it has ever been. But I think that while there's no electoral space, there is still political space. And I'm making the distinction here between the electoral elections and so on, and the political process, the work that has to go on, whether they're elections or not elections. And I think the WPA is critical, because in my view, it is still the one political party in this country that can speak to all Guyanese and get them to stop and listen. It has the moral authority to do so, because it has been a party that is steeped in struggle. Having not been in power, it doesn't have that taint of being in power. And you know, there's one thing I want to point out about the WPA. Most, if not all, of the leftist radical parties, the 1960s and 1970s, they've all folded. WPA is the only one that has continued to function. But I have to be frank with you.
And when you say that, you mean across the Caribbean?
Across the Caribbean. Across the Caribbean. But I have to be frank with you that the WPA is at a stage now where it has got to face the new reality, and it has got to go back to the drawing board and begin to ask itself certain questions and begin to answer those questions in a different way than it has done before.
You draw the distinction between political space,
yes,
and electoral space.
yes.
How can a political party take up political space and yet not have electoral appeal?
One in Guyana. Strange country. Strange country. When it comes to election, there is a battle for control of the state. And this battle is not simply between two parties. It's a battle between two races. Here in Guyana, the party is the race. And so whenever it comes down to that battle between the two races for control of the state of the country, there are no holds barred. And every other opinion is shoved out of the way by normal, decent, ordinary, reasonable people. Will find a way. Some people say they vote in straight race. Some people say, no, I'm not voting race, but the small parties can't win, and I can't back a loser. So there's all kinds of justification why people must get into this. It's a dark fight, and it's a fight between the two races for control of the state. Yet, once elections are over, Guyanese have been sensible. We talk about politicians using people, but the Guyanese people sometimes use politicians. And in between elections, they recognize the need for a WPA. WPA people tell me they meet them on the streets all the time.
Why aren't you speaking on this and why?
Yes, why aren't you speaking on this? They don't vote, but they expect. And so in their mode of operation, they have made that separation between the electoral politics and the political process. So I think there is a political role to be played by parties like the WPA. They will have to ask themselves whether they want to play that role, whether it is possible to play that role and still call yourself a political party.
That leads me inevitably to the question, should the WPA be contesting the upcoming elections?
When I left California, I was very strongly of that view. I expressed that view when asked by the WPA some months ago, and I was very clear that the WPA ought to participate. Since I came home and I've been talking to people outside of the WPA, talking to people inside of the WPA, I'm not so vigorous, I'm not so excited as I was when I came about the WPA's participation. There are some real problems on the ground. The WPA, of course, has its problem of resources and so forth. But it is the polarization that is so strong that you wonder whether you ought to be part of that dogfight. Having said that, I still think that the WPA ought to participate in the election. Because I still think there are a couple thousand people out there, Chris, who will have nothing to do with what is happening. And when they look around, I think the WPA is the one of what we call now in Guyana small party. The one small party that has the kind of intellectual and political capital that is needed, if only to sustain a certain kind of conversation in this country. Conversation about policy, conversation about the direction of the country. And so in that regard, I think that little space out there need to be captured by a responsible political party. And in that sense, I think the WPA ought to participate. And I would be arguing very vigorously inside of the WPA for that position.
I hope our common friend is listening.
But it's a hard task. I mean, we have to be frank with the viewers that the WPA is having that conversation right now about what to do about the upcoming election. It's not an easy conversation.
You're from Buxton?
Yes, Buxtonian.
The elder AUC Guyana.
Right.
Tell me, what is your view of AUC? And
AUC Guyana is easily, in my estimation, the most remarkable Guyanese that has come on the political scene over the last 50 years. I talked about Walter Rodney, but I think AUC Guyana is
for sheer longevity.
For sheer longevity, a remarkable individual, tremendous intellect. One of the
incisive wit.
Oh my goodness me! And very shrewd politician. Very shrewd politician. You would not like me to describe him as a politician, but in terms of politics, in terms of understanding political motion, Guyanese political motion, I have not met his match in Guyana.
And you don't only say that because he's a fellow Buxtonian?
No, not just because he's a fellow Buxtonian, but because this is what I see, and constantly, when you look at what's happening in Guyana, the only public figure, I think, with a moral authority to speak on some of the problems that we face, corruption, what is happening with the youth, the racial problem, it's the UC Guyana, but he's misunderstood. He's misunderstood because he doesn't engage in the kind of doublespeak that others engage in. He addresses issues and he speaks very frankly on them. And so people take out individual positions and they use them to say, oh, he's a racist. But Chris, I mean, if there is one person who doesn't have a racial bone in the body, it's the UC Guyana.
Over the past year, you were here last January, I think.
Right.
You came back in December. One of the new players, a new entrance onto the political arena, Mr. Ravi Dev, the organization and political movement ROAR. He's an Indian rights activist, quite openly. He has decided that he's entering into the political fray, the electoral fray.
Yeah.
What impact do you see on the racial situation and indeed the political situation being posed by someone like our organization like ROAR or AGDA with their very special biases?
I think that there is a role for ethnically based organizations like AGDA and pre-party ROAR in terms of dealing with the specific racial problems, specific problems of the races. In the same way I feel Amerindian organizations are important. Because I think there are issues that affect black people, that affect Indians, that affect Amerindians and other races in this country that cannot be dealt with by the political parties and the quote-unquote national organizations. And so I think there's a role, very important role for AGDA and for ROAR. And I welcome ROAR on the scene insofar as ROAR was dealing with the question of Indian rights and so on, and ensuring that Indian people understand and respect and be proud of their Indianness. I think is extremely important, and so I see an important role for ROAR in that regard. Now, once ROAR becomes a political party, that's a different ballgame. Because I think what happens then is that you ask Indians now to divide their loyalty between this Indian cultural movement, as I see it, and the Indian political party. And I say that because I think the PPP, for the most part, is an Indian political party. And once that happens, then you have the big dog fight, because the PPP is not going to allow ROAR to come in and influence and what they say, take away their supporters. That's one thing. But the other thing is that once ROAR becomes a political party and it begins to advocate for certain things, it pushes the PPP more into an Indian position. Huh? Because the PPP will have to stave off road. And the only way to stave off road is to move further into an Indian position. And once you do that, then there is less scope for a kind of non-racial, multiracial compromise. And I think the PPP is going through that kind of contortion right now. Having to secure its base by an attack from an Indian rights group that has come onto the political scene. My own sense is that Roar understands. I think Ravidev, I've listened to him, I've read his writings, I think he's extremely intelligent. And I think he understands that the Roar is not going to be able to break significantly into the PPP's base. But what it will do is that it will keep the PPP on its toes. And what that means is that it will keep the PPP anchored firmly into an Indian position. And so I think that presents a problem for the PPP.
No, despite the fact that I think we all know, whatever the politicians, whatever the PPP and the PNC say, we all know that they depend on this core racial support. They tend to want to get out of this mold whilst anchoring themselves in that support. So you have the PPP civic, now you've got the PNC reform, you've got everybody talking about inclusiveness.
Yes.
What is your view on these two major political parties' concept of inclusivity?
I think they're playing games. I think they're playing games. There was a time when I believed that they didn't know better. But now I know that they know better, and they're playing games. Let's take the PNC, for example. If the PNC were to come out and say, look, we have attempted to form a national party. Given the nature of Guyana, when you talk about national party, it's not going to be a multiracial party. We are a national party that is supported by Africans. And we want to say that, look, we are not going to sit by and allow the state and the government of this country to be perpetually controlled by one race. We don't think it's healthy for the country. And so therefore, we're advocating a national front. Put some pressure on the PPP to respond to that. But when you have both parties not talking about a national front government, then they're not interested in the nation. They're both hoping that they will get into power, and you will pull a few people from the other race as figureheads, and you put them up there, and you will go into, if you're an Indian government, you go into black areas and you share out some money, you do some roads, and you say, look, we are multiracial, we're inclusive. Well, Chris, inclusivity doesn't mean that. Inclusivity means that all sections of the population must feel a stake in what's happening in the country. They must feel that they are part of the process. They must feel it every time they go to work. They must feel it every time they walk on the street. They must not feel alienated from the political process. And until you have that kind of national consensus on the part of the two parties, then they're talking nonsense when they talk about inclusivity.
My final question. Elections, if all goes well, should be held on March 19th. To what extent will these elections bring relief and solve and solution to the endemic and underlying problems of Guyana?
They would not. They would not bring relief to the country. In fact, I predict that things are going to get worse, because there will be a loser and there will be a winner. Never in the history of our country has the loser lost and said, I will continue to play by the games and take the interest of the country. Never. Whenever the PPP has lost in the past, it has behaved in a certain way. Whenever the PNC is lost, it has behaved in a certain way. And so these elections, given the rules of the game that the two parties have retained, there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser. And whoever loses the election will not take the results, will not accept the results. And so therefore, I predict that we're going to have problems in Guyana. We may not have the same kind of problems that we had after 1997, but the Cold War, the racial Cold War will continue. There'll be no development, there'll be no stability. As a result, the economy will continue to be depressed, and people will continue to lose hope in this country.
The PPP, of course, will respond to that by saying when they lost elections that were not, by all tests,
right,
not free and fair, and that they were in fact cheated. Let me ask you a final question, David. What is your year 2001 resolution continuing contribution to our country?
I think given where I am, given my location, I've decided that I can contribute at the level of, if you want to call it ideas, trying to ignite and contribute to some kind of conversation on the country, to contribute to a kind of moving the level of discussion of politics and the social situation in the country to a new level. Because I think for all the hard earnedness of these politicians, I think those of us who are academics, who are part of what should be civil society, need to keep that pressure on the two parties. They are not going to shift their position. But when enough pressure is brought to bear on them, then I think they will at least begin to accommodate some new ideas. So I will continue in my own way to encourage others to up the pressure in terms of a level of discussion aimed at accountability, aimed at holding the government and the opposition parties accountable. It's not only the government should be held accountable. The opposition parties also have to be held accountable because they're part of the political process. The PPP feeds off the PNC and the PNC feeds off the PPP. It's not like the PPP is out there doing its thing and so on. They are responding to each other. And so therefore, I think a certain kind of accountability is very important.
Let me wish that your resolution for contributing to Guyana is in fact achieved, not least, David, because we need it, but also because of the quality and the sincerity of your contribution. I wish you a happy flight back, and we look forward to seeing you in Guyana again shortly.
Yes, I hope I can get to come for a couple of, at least a week around the elections time. I want to be here to be part of that process.
And thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Chris, for having me.
Good day and welcome to Plain Talk for this holiday weekend. 3 years after the Herdmanson Accord, President Barrett Jagdeo and leader of the opposition, Desmond Hoyt, met for the first time. The impact was immediate. Doom and gloom was replaced by hope, almost euphoria. Measures long stalled have been swiftly passed through the National Assembly. Have the PPP and the PNC Civic changed their positions? Where shall we be on January 18th, 2001? Will the optimism be justified? Was it an illusion? These are the issues we'll discuss as we get back on Plain Talk. With me on Plain Talk today is Dr. Rupert Roopnarine, leader of the Working People's Alliance, an intellectual who has dedicated his life for the development of Guyana. Dr. Roopnarine, welcome to Plain Talk.
Thank you.
You've invested considerable time, effort, and energy into the reduction of tensions in Guyana, the bringing together of the political parties. How significant was the December the 6th meeting of the parliamentary political leaders, including President Jagdeo and Desmond Hoyt?
I think it was very significant. It should be made clear that in that meeting, neither party surrendered any positions. But what was important was that for the very first time, the political parties with these irreconcilable positions were saying, look, we do have these positions, but let us sit down and discuss the way forward. That to me was a giant leap forward. It becomes much easier if you agree that, listen, we have here two irreconcilable ideas, but we're prepared to sit and see whether or not these ideas can somehow be explored. And certainly for me, I believe that a middle way has to be found. It's not a question of agreeing with this side or agreeing with that side. You know, there's a tendency in this country, which I think is unfortunate, in that you have these two, if you like, you know, two camps, or two sides, if you wish to call them that. And what happens is that anything you say is immediately seized upon to attach you to one side or the other. I have absolutely no interest in this at all. I do believe that for us to find a way forward, and I am hopeful, because in all the signals that have been coming from both parties, never mind the attachment to their original positions, they remain attached to their original positions, but my own view is that if you read carefully what the PNC has to say, is that they say, yes, the government has to demit office on January 17th, but we are prepared to find a way forward that is agreed upon by all of us. Now, in a real sense, that provides a window of opportunity to attempt to arrive at what I regard as a negotiated political solution. We're not the first country in the world where you have irreconcilable political differences, which in some unfortunate situations has actually led to armed conflict. We are a long way from that, and I hope we remain a long way from that forever. And the commitment of the leaders in the December 7th meeting was to say, listen, we have these two irreconcilable positions. Let us explore them. Let us explore these positions and see whether or not we can come up with something that will be acceptable to all sides. To me, that is hopeful. Obviously, people have said, you know, it would have been good if we could have come out of that meeting with an agreement. I think that would have been to hope for too much. I don't think that's how it works. I think the very fact that the leaders committed themselves to talking to each other was, for me, a significant step forward in terms of the political culture. You know, people entrenched behind their positions, screaming at each other, waving their fists at each other. I don't think that gets us very far, and it won't get us very far. We have a situation here where both sides have their arguments, and one of the failings in our situation, Chris, is that people are very reluctant, unwilling, perhaps incapable, of putting themselves in the shoes of the other when there is maximum disagreement. And that is a real failing. I recall that when we had made a trip to Northern Ireland, when we were discussing with the President of the Republic of Ireland, and she was saying, in relation to the Good Friday Agreement, where the civil conflict that had been raging there since the late 1960s had come to a rather fragile understanding, which is still daily under pressure. But the fact is, she was making the point to us who were visiting, that except you are prepared to put yourself in the shoes of your opponent and really try to see things from how they are seeing them, you render yourself incapable of arriving at a solution. That is what I think is necessary here. I don't think that the screaming that, you know, I have a moral and constitutional right to carry on, and the other side saying, you signed an agreement, you have no moral or constitutional right to carry on. I understand that as opening positions, and I have no difficulty with them. But what I'm convinced of is that we as Guyanese, without outside interference or outside assistance, can sit together and try to find a middle road, which will involve both parties making compromises. Let's make no mistake about it. That is in the nature of negotiated solutions. A negotiated solution is not one where everybody comes to agree with one side or everybody comes to agree with another side. That's not a negotiated solution. A negotiated solution is where both sides are prepared to give up some aspects of their original position to arrive at a middle ground where neither is completely happy, but they can live with the solution that has been found. I think that is the work of the committee. The work of the committee is to attempt to work away at these options in a sincere way, in a very sincere way. When I ask, for instance, when I ask the PNC, let us have some details about what you mean by an interim administration. How could it work? What would we have to do with the Constitution? I'm trying to make a sincere effort to understand how it is they see the overcoming of the practical difficulties and practical considerations if we were, after January 17th, to have an interim arrangement. Similarly, when the PPP says, well, we are going to stay in power with limitations, I want to understand exactly what areas are going to be, these limitations are going to apply to, and how will they work? Are you going to just make a voluntary declaration that in these areas we will accept limitations? Or are you prepared to consider formal and structural limitations? For instance, the PPP has said that no legislation will be passed in this period except with all-party consensus. Now, are they prepared to extend that idea to the other areas that they have proposed limitations, that there should be all-party consensus in a structured way in all of these areas? Are they prepared to extend those areas? I believe that we have to probe the options in a serious way. And it would be unfortunate if either party saw the inter-party committee as simply a way of going there and putting their position and being unwilling to shift from it. If we don't have a shifting of ground and a willingness to sincerely explore the options that we have before us, it's not going to work.
But you described the positions more than once in your opening remarks as irreconcilable.
They are irreconcilable in the sense that the two positions are in violent conflict. I mean, you can't see your way if you were to accept one or the other. They are clear cut. One position is that you have to leave office. The other position is that they will remain in office and do X, Y, and Z. Now, how can we find a way through this? It'll test our ingenuity, it'll test our patience, it'll test our creativity. But if you're saying to me that at the beginning of this century, Guyanese cannot sit together in the full knowledge of all the experience we've had in the country and try to arrive at a solution without calling in some more wise people, I must tell you, I have zero confidence in all of this external mediation. It would be a tragedy to me if, yet again, we as Guyanese cannot sit around the table and arrive at a solution without calling on some big brother or big sister to come here and help us out.
Your party is part of these discussions. It has completely left out civil society, people not represented in
Yes.
Parliament. Why did you go for that option?
Well, I think that there was an understanding that we would try to find some way, some mechanism to involve civil society in whatever arrangements are going to be finally agreed on. I must tell you that since the days of the Constitutional Reform Commission, you may recall that during the entire process of the Constitutional Reform Commission, civil society played a very important role. They were represented on the commission, and in the sense that the commission opened itself to opinion from outside of the political parties, I would say that during the constitutional reform process, civil society was a main player. Since then, we've had civil society playing a very active role, whether it was in terms of attempting to mediate the public service strike and things like that. But what bothered me, and it says so in the report, if you read the CRC report, it acknowledges the fact that when we closed down the CRC, when we submitted our report, and the process went into the select committee, there was in fact a narrowing. It was an exclusion from that point of any formal participation by civil society. Because we went into the select committee, that was exclusively a parliamentary affair. We then went into the oversight committee. There again, it was an exclusively parliamentary affair. And you can say that the participation of civil society from the end of the process of the Constitutional Reform Commission has been completely miniaturized. I think that led to a weakening of the process myself. I believe that we attempted to make some arrangements in the Oversight Committee whereby parties would be allowed to have advisors who can come with them, who would not have voting rights, but who can sit there and, with the permission of the chair, be allowed to participate. We did do that, and there were instances when people who were not on the Select Committee, or on the Oversight Committee, or indeed in Parliament, who did come as advisors attached to the participants. It was a little bit of a measure, but it was not, I think, it doesn't go to the heart of what you're asking. I think that one of the things that I hope the Inter-Party Committee is going to discuss is whatever arrangements are put in place. And one of the PNC's proposals, I should say, does have a place for civil society in the sense that in the interim arrangement that they are proposing, which is that you would have 5 people administering the country after January 17, 1 person heading the administration who would effectively fulfill the functions, carry out the functions of the president, and 4 administrators or commissioners, whatever you want to call them, actually carrying out the work of ministers. And then, above that arrangement, you would have a civil society grouping that would act as a kind of civil society oversight over the operations of this interim administration. So in their proposal, there is, I think, a role for civil society. And what we have to see is whether in the other proposals coming from the PPP, having to do with having to do with limitations, whether in that proposal as well, there can be devised a role for civil society. So that in the final negotiated solution arrived at by the Inter-Party Committee, I think it would be a duty of the committee to find some way to ensure that civil society is included in the arrangements, whether this will be a formal arrangement, which I hope it will. I have little faith in these informal arrangements. I prefer things to be structured and formal, and see how it goes. But I think that one of the tasks we have is to see what kind of role can be played by civil society in an effective way.
January 17th is less than 1 month
Yes.
away. There are several options, very complex issues
Yes.
to be resolved. There's Christmas, the New Year's, etc. coming on us. Do we have enough time to resolve these issues?
Well, we must have enough time. The issues have to be resolved. Whether we can resolve them before Christmas, that was my hope. And it was the hope of the Inter-Party Committee as well. We did impose on ourselves, as it turned out, an unworkable time frame. But we had hoped to get this matter completed before Christmas. From the way things are going now, I think that was probably over-optimistic. But certainly they have to be resolved, if not before Christmas, then very early in the new year. As January 17th approaches, I think that imposes its own urgency. And my sense is that, that the parties will adhere to the time frame, commit themselves to it, because obviously it has a time frame built into it. We have to resolve the matter well before January 17th. And the sooner we resolve it, the better, because in addition to the question of resolving post-January 17 governance, the committee also has the task given it by the leaders' meeting of remaining in place until the holding of the elections. So we have to be discussing other matters, such as the date of the dissolution of Parliament, such as the legislative agenda. It's not only post-17 governance that we have to sort out. We have to sort that out first. But based on that solution, we have to then construct a work plan that would in fact take us up to March 19th, which is a date that has been set for the election.
Very rapidly, we've seen a number of pieces of legislation impinging on the Constitution passed in Parliament.
Yes.
How thoroughly were these pieces of legislation reviewed and considered?
I think fairly thoroughly. I mean, the disagreements that we are having at this stage, I think, are fairly minor disagreements. And let us remember that we are working on a time frame. I do not believe that in the interest of perfection, because we want as perfect bills as we can, obviously, to go onto the books, especially into the Constitution. But I don't think that in the interest of achieving that level of perfection, we should leave incomplete the task of putting the bills into Parliament and getting them in the Constitution. Don't forget that we have a kind of fail-safe mechanism built into the constitutional reform process, which is a standing committee on constitutional reform that is going to be established in the new Parliament. That standing committee on constitutional reform, which, by the way, will include people who are non-parliamentarians, actually attached permanently to the committee. I'm not talking now about advisors. The constitutional reform process has defined that committee very carefully. And we saw the need to have on it experts who can be drafted onto the committee as full members. This was a center of a lot of debate as to whether or not you can have a parliamentary committee with non-parliamentarians on it and so on. We ventilated that fully in the Oversight Committee, and we finally agreed that the standing committee would be established to include these people. Now, that standing committee will have the task of overseeing the operations of the new constitution, and the task also of completing some of the work that we have left undone, or some of the work which we didn't bring to perfection. So that even if there are little flaws here and there in terms of what we have so far achieved, there is the Standing Committee on Constitutional Reform that will be able to deepen that process and, if necessary, make the necessary rectifications. Having said that, I think one of the really positive things to have flowed from the leaders' meeting was the commitment, the renewal of the commitment to bring the remaining constitutional reforms into the National Assembly as soon as possible. And I think, as you've pointed out, you can see that there has been an acceleration of that process, and I think it is to be welcomed, because, as you know, it is my long-held view, which I've made public in time after time, that Herdmanston imposes on us a duty not only to hold a decent and proper election, but also to do it in certain conditions. And one of those conditions has to do with the completion of a constitutional reform process. Now, the work of constitutional reform is virtually complete at this stage. All the reforms have been drafted by the Oversight Committee with the assistance of the drafting team that included people like Chancellor Messiah, Justice Legal, Roxanne George, Alexis Downs Amsterdam, Mr. Durjan. I mean, this is a really high-powered drafting team that worked with the Oversight Committee to bring those drafts to a sort of, constitutional acceptability. Now, after the Oversight Committee completed its drafts, it goes to the drafting committee again for fine-tuning it and turning it into bills for the National Assembly. That drafting committee has completed most of its work. There are very, very few areas which they have not, in fact, brought to that stage. So that putting them into the National Assembly is now simply a matter of the logistics in relation to Parliament and, as I say, fine-tuning some of the actual bills. And the important thing is not only to bring the bills to reform the constitutional articles, but also to bring the necessary enabling legislation that will allow us to operationalize the articles of the Constitution. This is a heavy legislative agenda, but we have recommitted to getting it done before the elections. And as you can see, for instance, in the area of the Ethnic Relations Commission, that work is virtually complete. We have one remaining piece of enabling legislation, which is to do with the amendments of Representation of the People's Act, to stipulate what the offenses are and what the penalties are for breaking the rules of the Ethnic Relations Commission. That will be in place next time Parliament meets, which I anticipate will be very soon. We then have the various other reforms having to do with Parliament, the judiciary, the commissions, and various things. I have myself attempted to define what I think of as a minimum Herdmanston package, which really, I believe, will transform considerably the governance environment within which a government that emerges in the next election will be operating. And it's very important.
That's an interesting term, minimum Herdmanston package. Now, if I recall, Herdmanston spoke of the cessation of street activities, language and conduct of the political players, dialogue, constitutional reform, then elections. How far are we now from having achieved what Herdmanston envisaged?
Well, I think there were a lot of shortcomings. And to my mind, one of the failings of the process has been the unwillingness of the third signatory, because remember, it's not only the PPP and the PNC who signed the Herdmanston Accord, it was also signed by CARICOM. And to my mind, one of the failings of the process has been the inability of CARICOM, or its unwillingness, to actually do its own independent audit of the Herdmanston Accord. You keep getting, unfortunately, this is our political environment, you get accusations from both sides that this one has violated the accord, that one has violated the accord, this one didn't come into Parliament, that one didn't do this, and it goes to and fro. Unfortunately, the CARICOM, who were, after all, the brokers of the accord, have not sat down and done an independent audit of the accord, so that you still have varying views on the audit commission, you still have varying views about whether the PNC honored the agreement to come into Parliament. You get accusations that the reason for the delay is because the PNC didn't come into Parliament. PNC argues the reason for the delay is because the PPP has been dragging its feet, and so on. This, I must tell you, my sense is that the country is weary of this particular form of the debate. We need to go beyond it, and I had hoped that CARICOM would have done that kind of audit and said that, look, the audit commission, when we look at it, either did well or did badly. The dialogue, how do we make an audit of the dialogue? What did it yield? What did it fail to yield? The constitutional reform process, are we satisfied that what we had intended, this has gone forward? Do we believe that race relations, which we put at the center of the Herdmanston Accord and the St. Lucia Agreement, do we believe that the necessary steps have been taken to ameliorate the situation? All of that, none of that has been done. And I think that that is a weakness. The other thing that is not helping us, and I must say this bluntly, is the delay that the court, the delay the court is in fact incurring in terms of the judgment in the elections petition. Do you know, since we have begun our election petition hearing, the Florida Supreme Court and the Supreme Court of the United States have issued maybe 20 decisions. Now, we've had a process going in excess of 2 years. The hearing has actually ended many, many months ago. And up to this point, we cannot get a decision out of the court. That is not helping us either. For as long as we don't get a decision out of the court, then the opposing versions of the 1997 elections continue to be made. The accusations continue to be made, and so on. I had hoped that by now, the court would have ruled on the petition and, in a sense, set the record, lay the record down, and then we can proceed from there. In the absence of the court decision, I believe that our entire process has become more difficult, more complex, and in a sense, the two sides continue to be rather unyielding.
You have identified a number of the deficiencies, non-achievements on the Herdmanston. You've pointed out a number of achievements, particularly in the area of constitutional reform, the legislative changes, and so on. Do you get the feeling that there is absolute commitment, that people are honoring Herdmanston now, since the December meeting of the leaders, in the spirit as well as in the letter?
I still think we have to go some way before we can say that the spirit of Herdmanston is being respected. Hopefully, the political solution which we are attempting to craft in the Inter-Party Committee will be faithful to the spirit of Herdmanston. I think it must. The spirit of Herdmanston was, in a sense, reconciliation. How are we to reconcile? Whether or not the Inter-Party Committee achieves the reconciliation that is required will answer your question as to whether or not the spirit of Herdmanston is actually being honored. I would say that since Herdmanston, since the St. Lucia Agreement, the accord and the agreement have been honored in the breach more than anything else. I do not feel that that either the letter or the spirit have been honored personally. Yes, people did come off the streets, but that was not, that process towards normalization was not completed. And that is why you had to have the St. Lucia Agreement. The St. Lucia Agreement came when essentially the agreements of Herdmanston broke down. I myself feel that it was a little perhaps necessary but unfortunate that in St. Lucia, since we had already lost 6 months after Herdmanston, the St. Lucia Agreement reasserted the Herdmanston deadlines, even though 6 months had been taken out of the process. Perhaps they had to do that to get the kind of agreement that they eventually got, but to my mind that was unfortunate. You can't say on the one hand that a process will take 18 months, and then 6 months after the process has not started, you come back and say, yes, it has to end by such and such a date, which effectively means that what you'd anticipated would have taken 18 months, you are now saying can be achieved in a year. And that has, I think, put us in a bit of a problem. And I think that, unfortunately, what has happened to Herdmanston is that people have come to focus exclusively on the January 17th date. And that has been, to a certain extent, fetishized. It's been fetishized by everyone. The donors are fetishizing it, the parties. And the thing to understand, if you read the accord, or if you read Section 9 of the Constitutional Reform Act, which is the act which the PNC argues supersedes the accord and the agreement because it is now in the statutes of Guyana, and they're of course technically completely correct. If you read Section 9, you will see that it doesn't only impose a date for an election, it says that the election will be held at the end of a certain process, which is the process of constitutional reform. The date has always been tied to the completion of the constitutional reform process. So that it seems to me a pity that the people who are as insistent as they are on the electoral side of things are not equally insistent on the preconditions for that election that are in fact established in the very document which they are using to emphasize the January 17th date.
I'm speaking with Dr. Rupert Roopnarine on Plain Talk today as we discuss the road to January 17th and beyond. Please stay tuned. Any significance? Welcome back to Plain Talk with Dr. Rupert Roopnarine. You mentioned the inordinate, almost inexplicable delay in the handing of the judgment on the election, the 1997 elections petition. Recently, the whole question of the voters list has come under intense scrutiny when we've got tens of thousands of names not being able to be accounted for. Are the two in any way related, the list for the 2001 and 1997 elections?
I wish they weren't, because, you know, sometimes I think that, you know, you're attempting to cry out in the wilderness in this place. Right at the beginning, when we were discussing the question of the list, I attempted to argue as strongly as I could at the time that it would be a mistake to bring forward into the next elections anything from the 1997 election. Let us put closure on 1997. If we want to construct a list, let us do a new house-to-house registration. That was my clear advice. I was told that, well, this can't be done in time for January 17th. We still don't have January 17th, and we have a lot of controversy over the list. This controversy over the list could well have been avoided. It was, to my mind, from the beginning, a mistake to bring forward into 2001 any of the baggage of 1997. And I must say, without any disrespect to persons, that I would have preferred to see that applied also to the Secretariat of the Commission. I would have preferred to have a completely clean sweep, bring in new officers, train them, and so on. Instead, you know, we have some of the same managers or mismanagers, if you heard the evidence in the elections court. We have the same managers who are managing the process again, and we are in fact using the database from '96, which I had never had any faith in. Having said that, where are we now? We are now in a situation where the National Register of Registrants has been called into question, that people are arguing that the numbers seem improbably high. To me, they seem improbably high. I don't know any situation where an electoral roll in situations like ours can go beyond 50 to 58% of the actual population. And to be asked to believe that in a population of 750,000, you could possibly have 550,000 voters is really to strain credulity. I don't see how that can possibly be. My understanding is that
Is it 550 or 520?
So, well, I think what they're talking about now is 420. And I think that the arrangement which the Elections Commission seems to be arriving at, which is that you will have a list of those who have been photographed. And I think that there is some thought in the Elections Commission of extending the photographic period even more, to give people until sometime in January to come forward and get photographed. This is, I think, a final call to the population to say to you, look, if you have not yet gotten photographed, come and get photographed. They will then, I think the understanding is, they will then have a list of the photographed people who will get their national ID cards. Then there is thought being given to a secondary list. A secondary list where people will be given a voter identification short of a national ID card, and those people would be the people who were on the list, who cannot be accounted for in the sense of having migrated or having died, but who cannot be found and haven't come forward to be photographed. Some special arrangement is going to be made, sort of list A and a list B, understanding that the final voters list is list A plus list B. I think that is the kind of solution that the Elections Commission seems to be straining after. I hope it resolves the problem, because I have had a great concern about the possible legal and constitutional dilemmas that the decision about the final voters list will actually rest on. My understanding from the Commission is that up to very recently, yesterday, they had been discussing this matter, and I think they're coming close to a solution which will be acceptable to all sides. I hope that is so. I have some other concerns. You've gone onto the voters list, but I have some other concerns which really have to do with the production and distribution of the ID cards. As you may know, in 1997, this was a horrendous problem. Cameras overheating and burning out. And in the end, on the day of the election, the Elections Commission was still in possession of 38,000 cards. This is not tolerable. We have a situation, as we know, Guyana is not an easy country to move around in. The Elections Commission, I think, has attempted to come to grips with that problem by beginning the distribution of the cards in the hinterland, even while the production of the cards on the coast is actually going on. I think that's the kind of solution they're arriving at. But I continue to have grave concerns about our capacity, one, to produce, because we know what the conditions are here. I mean, when I heard the chairman of the commission putting forward his program, I had to wonder if this was Guyana that he was attempting to carry out this program in, because anyone involved in the production of anything in Guyana, I think, understands the kind of indigenous constraints, to put a polite term to it, that we have to face. And I think as a result that the program of production is a little over-optimistic, and I certainly have great fears about distribution. When we are talking about getting cards into the Northwest District and deep in the Pacaraimals and so on, then this is going to pose severe logistical challenges. And I hope that the Elections Commission is going to be able to do it. And I certainly am of the view that they must get the maximum assistance from civil society, political parties, and all the citizens of the country. We just cannot continue to behave as Guyanese like to behave, that this is somebody else's work. It's not simply somebody else's work. It is the work of all of us to attempt to ensure that these processes go forward as smoothly as they possibly can.
But those processes are absolutely necessary and required to be efficiently executed.
Yes, indeed.
If we're going to have a March 19th general election.
Indeed.
Are you questioning that date?
I'm a skeptic on these matters, as you probably know. I don't want to say I'm questioning the date. In the face of the agreement of everyone about the date, I did not erect difficulties, but I remain, let me say, I remain concerned that the processes can be accomplished and executed as smoothly as they need to be executed, as efficiently as they need to be executed, given the time frame. I have a third concern that is even a larger concern, and that has to do with the importance of voter education. We have to explain as early as possible the new voting system that Guyanese are going to be using on March 19th. For the very first time since independence, we are going to an election under what is a substantially changed electoral system. I don't think that its difficulties should be underestimated, and the sooner we can explain to Guyanese how the national top-up list is going to work, how Parliament is going to be composed, what does it mean to be voting for constituency candidates, how does this relate to the regional elections, the sooner we can come out in a clear way and explain this not only to parties, party officials, but the general public. And bear in mind again, we're not talking about only educating the coast, where you have the benefits of television and radio and all of this. You're talking about also having a duty to carry out this voter education in the remote areas of the country where electors will have to be casting their vote. It is very important that the last man and woman in the Pacaraimals and in the Northwest understand when they go forward on March 19th what they are doing.
Let's go back to this January arrangement, this all-party committee. You're leaving for the United Kingdom tomorrow.
Well, I'm going to the States. I have a family commitment.
Where does that take our talks?
I think that's all right. We have a working agenda. We have alternates. I anticipate that if the committee works over Christmas, I have my doubts that too much gets done in Guyana in the week before and the week after Christmas, but we can remain optimistic that the committee might sacrifice this Christmas and continue to work. But if it does, we have procedures to ensure that the work of the committee continues to go forward.
One of the concerns that have been raised about these talks is the authority of the participants. Indeed, properly or improperly, it came out that you had questioned the authority and the participation of a certain gentleman, Mr. Basil Williams. Is it your view that the authority resides in the individual members of the committee to get the work done?
Chris, I hope you'll understand if I say that I don't want to discuss that matter in any detail, because the commitment that we made in the Inter-Party Committee is that this, in fact, will be an internal matter. It will be resolved there, that the leaders will be communicated with, and I was completely astonished to find that in spite of a decision to put an embargo in relation to the press on this matter, at least until the leaders had been given the courtesy of receiving the letter and deliberating on it and communicating to the committee, that there would be no publicity to this. Unfortunately, this did not happen. I believe that mischief makers, and I say it bluntly, mischief makers leaked the letter to the newspapers even before it was in the hands of the leaders to whom it was addressed. I think this is a real shame. It doesn't augur well for party relations or for the necessary kind of atmosphere of trust. And I am not, as a result, going to answer your question in any detail. We are meeting this evening, and I intend to continue to deal with the matter there. I have not been, up to this point, been informed by the leaders to whom my concerns were addressed, or how they regard them. And until I get that, I'm most unwilling to discuss it. Let me just say that we are determined in the WPA. We are determined that nothing of this kind should stand in the way of the work of the committee, and we are fully committed to continuing to work in the committee under any circumstances, and we will go there. We have made our point. I believe that if you're striving after a negotiated political solution, that you give yourself the best chance of success if the people who meet are the people who are most familiar with the issues and who in effect have some authority to bind their parties. This is a general position having nothing to do with Mr. Williams personally. I must say that had any of the parties named a representative who was less than familiar with the most recent political issues, I would have been raising the same concerns. This is not a concern, to my friends in the PNC or to Mr. Williams himself. But as I said, I would prefer to, restrict myself to those remarks until we get to the committee this evening and I'm able to discuss it more freely.
The process that is taking place now is essentially a political one, seeking a political
Yes,
solution.
it is a political process.
We have, of course, got an act that endorses the Herdmanson deadline. Is it possible that any of the parties may then resort to the court to try to get a resolution if this committee fails in its work?
I don't know how that could work. I mean, I've heard speculations that since neither Mansour nor myself signed the Herdmanson Accord, we were not bound by it. I have always found this rather amusing because we certainly are bound by the statute to which we contributed and on which we voted. But I don't believe that given our experience with election matters in the court, we should seek that avenue of resolution myself because we may not get a decision until 2003. I think we should try to solve it politically. And as I say, I continue to believe that this is not beyond the political leadership of the country.
Including the constitutional arrangement for post-January 17th?
Including whatever arrangements we need to make. I am strongly in favor of formal arrangements, whether it will go as far as a constitutional amendment or whether in fact it will require the amending of Section 9 of the CRC Act, or whether or not we will have it in the form of a motion establishing a protocol after January 17th. I don't know what form it will take, but I'm strongly in favor of some very formal mechanism rather than just the declarations of political parties.
Has the committee consulted with lawyers to try to work out a formal mechanism?
Well, I don't know if the committee hasn't, as a committee, but I would be surprised if parties within the committee are not taking legal advice in this area. I mean, I know that I'm certainly trying to get as much assistance on that front as I possibly can. Yesterday I was looking at the 13th Amendment to the Bangladesh Constitution, which is very unique in that it establishes constitutional rules for a caretaker government before elections. Bangladesh is unique in this regard. I've gotten the 13th Amendment, which I'm looking at. I'm also looking at the South African Code of Conduct for Political Parties that is not simply voluntary, but is rooted in statute. And I'm also attempting to find the protocol that governs the behavior of the incumbent party in the Indian electoral situation, because I believe that India also has some regulations which we would do well to look at. Whatever we do, and I think there's general agreement. I recall that President Jagdeo himself has said that his view is that in the future we need to essentially craft some legislation that will govern the conduct of political parties in the pre-election period. I completely agree with him. In fact, we may need to do it now.
Maybe the opportunity. The UK has conventions.
It has conventions, and we should be very cautious about these UK conventions. They also have long centuries of behavior to guide them. For instance, a lot of Commonwealth countries took over this formulation about consultation. The Prime Minister shall consult with the leader of the opposition. Well, in a culture where consultation is understood to mean something, you bring that into cultures where consultation is redefined, to me next to nothing, and you put it in your constitution, and then you find yourself in the position we found ourselves in, which is having to call it meaningful consultation and to attempt to define it in a special provision of the constitution, what consultation actually means. That's not necessary in England, where they have a certain convention and a certain culture having to do with this. They don't have to spell it out. Unfortunately, in many of our societies, we do have to spell them out. I think it would be a mistake to import too many of the Westminster customs in situations where Westminster customs don't have the necessary environment to flower.
With respect to seeking guidance from the court,
Yeah.
do you envisage any disagreement at the level of the Elections Commission? For example, you're talking about a list A and a list B. Sounds to me a little bit of a recipe for confusion.
Well, I think it's a recipe for compromise. You know, you have these block objections that have been put by the PNC. Then you have, of course, the constitutional requirements, Articles 59 and 159. They have a real dilemma. How are they going to resolve it? Well, you know, there are no residence qualifications for Guyanese to be on the voters list. If you have a Guyanese mother, you can live on the North Pole, and once you are here for registration, you can be on the voters list. There's nothing to prevent you. The only residence qualification we have put into the Constitution in the recent reforms is for the President and by extension the Prime Minister. But other than that, there is no residence qualification.
So what do you think about photographs then?
Well, that's it. You see, it's a tricky situation. Whether or not the Elections Commission has the authority to say that it really depends only on your having a photograph. I think it's open to court challenge. And I think this is the dilemma that the Commission recognizes and which they're trying to work through. I've just put to you what is, I believe, the latest thinking on the Commission on how to deal with this matter. But it does present a real difficulty which should not be underestimated.
Because that suggests that, forget it, if you haven't photographed, you can still go and vote once your name is on the list.
Well, they're attempting to, as I say, devise a mechanism where the people who are on the list without photographs will have, in fact, a form of voter identification. That's the latest thinking. I can't say how it is going to be finally resolved, but I can tell you that this thinking is about 24 hours old. They're continuing to discuss the matter. But this is something which they need to find a resolution for very quickly.
The All-Party Committee, would its findings and decisions now have to go to Parliament for formal endorsement?
Well, it depends on whether you accept the argument that you should have a formal arrangement to govern all of this. That is strongly my argument. It's not fully accepted by all sides that you require this. I hope it is finally accepted. I think there's still some thinking that it is sufficient for parties to commit themselves perhaps in an agreement, a signed agreement, and so on. I am sorry to say that I have learned to be very skeptical about some of these voluntary declarations and agreements. It's like codes of conduct. We dutifully sign codes of conduct prior to elections, and within 1 week of the campaign, the codes of conduct are thrown out of the window. I believe that codes of conduct only actually work if we have a body that oversees their operation and sanctions in place to ensure that the violations of the code will be met with serious action. That is the way it operates in South Africa. It's the way it operates in some countries. We need to ground the code in some statutes, and I'm in favor of as many formal arrangements as possible. So to answer your question, yes, I think that once the solution is agreed on, should we reach it, once that solution is agreed on, I believe it should have legislative formalization.
Assuming elections are held on March the 19th, in your opinion, have voting patterns and culture changed enough that would alter the political landscape and composition of the National Assembly?
If I believed that, I would not have been fighting so hard for a governmental system that is going to make special arrangements for inclusion. It is because I don't believe that. that I think that special constitutional arrangements and governmental arrangements have to be made to accommodate how it is this population likes to vote.
Is there then room for other players than the PPP and the PNC given our current political situation?
Well, my feeling is, you know, that the room that there used to be even in the 60s, when there was, I think, a certain amount of space in between these two parties, my sense is that from 92 to now, that space has considerably lessened. There has been a shrinking of that space, and I think that applies not only to other political parties, but even to civil society. The society seems to me to be fairly polarized. I know that both political parties like to think that the crossover vote will be so significant that they can then put themselves forward as essentially having a national mandate. That has not been my experience in the situation in Guyana. If it happens, no one will be happier than I would be, but it is not my feeling that that is about to happen. It may happen for your children or your grandchildren. I don't think it will happen for us. And for us, I think we have to resign ourselves to this pattern of voting behavior and make the necessary systemic and constitutional arrangements to accommodate it, so that the elections, when they are completed, that the people who lose the elections don't believe that they have lost absolutely everything, but that there is a system in place to include them in the government and administration of the country.
This is going to be the final issue of Plain Talk for the year 2000. Tell me what you see as the best scenario, best possible scenario coming out for the year 2001 for Guyana.
The best possible scenario is that the work of the Inter-Party Committee and the promise, if I can call it that, of the leaders' meeting of December 7th will in fact lead to a political solution that settles the country down, that we can remove tension, that the pre-election campaign period can be one of the honest and open and vigorous debate of ideas, that we can put an end to hate speech, that we can in fact go into the next elections like a civilized people about to make a civilized political choice, and to live with the consequences of our choice, and to have the country get out of the political logjam that's been in for the last 3 years and proceed about our business, recognizing that the greatest dangers to Guyana's development come not from within Guyana, but come from outside of Guyana, and that we have to steel ourselves and build the necessary national resilience to deal with what remain extremely unequal terms of international trade and all manners of things. We have border issues to resolve, and I would like to see a national agenda agreed on by the major political players and to take power off the agenda. If we can remove power from the agenda, from the national agenda for the year, the year that is ahead of us, I would believe that Guyanese can begin to take stock of where we are and how to get to where we ought to be.
I think all Guyanese would want to say, and so say all of us. Dr. Roopnarine, thank you very much, and all the best for the new year.
Thank you, Chris, and to you.